We're honored tonight to host the National Press Club Centennial Forum in New York City and a very distinguished panel of journalists who are here to discuss the First Amendment and the future of journalism. Our moderator for the evening is Gil Klein. Gil served for 25 years as national correspondent for Media General News Service. He covered the White House, Congress, the Supreme Court, and national political campaigns. Now Gil is director of the National Press Club Centennial Project, which commemorates the 100th anniversary of the National Press Club. As you know, the Press Club has excelled for many, many years at providing a forum for national and international leaders to interact with the press about important issues. And we're delighted to be the host now as the Press Club goes on the road. Gil, welcome.
I want to thank our co-sponsors for this forum, the Foreign Press Association, and especially its president, Noel Lateef, and New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, Brooke Kroger, and Kate Panuski. Every day you see headlines, whether it's the Washington Post cutting 100 reporters, or the Palm Beach Post slashing its reporting staff in half, or whether the Newhouse News Bureau is being just completely eliminated after decades of doing great Washington reporting. Reporters want to know what is happening. Will the press still be the watchdog of government? Is there a threat to the First Amendment and freedom of the press? But this is also a great time of innovation. So where is journalism heading? We have this extraordinarily distinguished panel who can talk not just about what is happening in New York City, but across the nation and around the world. Start with Tom Curley, is president of the Associated Press, which is the largest news gathering organization in the world. Before that, he was editor of USA Today. A few years ago, when multimedia journalism was just beginning, he gave me a tour of USA Today to explain how he was implementing that convergence. Jill Abramson is the managing editor of the New York Times. Veteran at the time, she was Washington bureau chief during the run-up to the Iraq War before her promotion to managing editor. Dan Rather, at the end, has one of the most recognizable names and faces in journalism, with more than 4 decades in television news. He was the anchor of CBS Evening News before leaving in a dispute over a story on President Bush's military record. He's now doing the type of long-form television journalism he says he always wanted to do as the global correspondent and managing editor of Dan Rather Reports on HDNet. Jay Rosen is a press critic and writer whose primary focus is the media's role in democracy. Member of the faculty here at NYU since 1986, he teaches courses in media criticism. He is a champion of citizen journalism and the role of bloggers in the news media. Now I'm going to throw out some questions to our panelists, but I encourage you all to jump in and make this a lively discussion, if not a free-for-all. And at the end, after we've done this for a while, we'll encourage you to come up and ask your own questions here. There's a microphone set up here. So when the time comes, you can all line up there, and it'll be your great chance to get a shot at these people. Now, as I go around the nation holding these forums, I see and hear that in these times of revenue losses, newspapers are cutting Washington reporters and state capitol reporters. They're dropping auxiliary wire services. Why? Well, because the Associated Press will do it all. And the AP is also the main source of news in when you log into Yahoo, which is where many people get most of their news. That's quite a responsibility. Tom, can the AP really be all things to all people, and should it?
Really appreciate the chance to go first tonight, Gil, on these types of questions. But let me begin by thanking the audience. I think it's really encouraging for those of us on the panel to look out and see this much interest in the press. It's the best news that I can imagine that any of us have had in months. So thank you for being here, and thank you for caring about what really is important. The short answer is AP can't be all things to all people, and if you go back through the history of reporting at the State House or reporting in Washington, the original reporters who went from their papers were there to give accountability on their representatives who were in Washington or at state houses. And AP's coverage of these institutions, whether state or federal, is more at a higher level. So I think a gap is being created. We have been looking at what that means, and as recently as July, we were speaking with some newspapers about finding a way to collectively pull some resources and plug the gap, so while one newspaper or a series of newspapers could no longer afford someone to provide that detailed accountability, perhaps together we might add somebody. But you know what's happened in the last 100 days, and a dire situation has turned now into one of absolutely fighting for survival. So those concepts seem off the table. I think all you have to do is to look at what's happened to the states. They're not getting the coverage at the state houses that is required to make them function properly in a democracy. There are some absolute shambles of state government as we look at the situations from around the country. So it is quite serious. I do believe that the one area that we are really being resolute about is international, and we've had some criticism from domestic editors who think we ought to stop covering international because they've had to close some of their foreign bureaus. We believe that the responsibility on us is greater than ever, and we have been working very, very hard to make sure that we are doing the best possible job and that we have the best possible people in place. So we have redoubled our efforts there.
Well, Bill, that gets me into what I wanted to ask you, which is when I go around the country, I hear people say, well, we have we don't need to cover, we don't need to put foreign news in our newspaper. We'll just do local, local, local. We've got people can go on the web and read the New York Times. But of course, foreign news correspondents.
We're happy to have them.
Yes, but foreign news is very expensive to do. And can you keep up? And is this also a good thing for journalism?
We haven't retreated one bit from foreign coverage. We've had to, as different parts of the world heat up, we've had to redeploy some people from one place to another, but our commitment to cover the world is as big and serious as it's ever been. The problem right now is, between the election and the financial crisis, trying to protect space, especially on the front page these days for great foreign stories, has become a little tougher, but the pipeline is full of them. I was just, before I came here, doing a kind of hideous Sophie's Choice between, gripping story about the Congo and one about the, horrible situation in China with, milk for, poison milk for babies, and, these very rich stories done by, New York Times correspondents who, devote themselves fully to covering their countries and areas and regions, both for the newspaper, and we also own the International Herald Tribune, and obviously we've got the largest newspaper website, which now, amplifies our stories and extends our reach in really profound ways. And, the business environment is very challenging, and Tom is absolutely right to say, on top of what was already a very challenging environment, we now have what's going on in the economy, which will, make the impact even worse. But I feel very blessed that at the Times, we've had to retreat from some beats and some areas of coverage, but nothing where I feel we are disappointing our readers with our commitment to cover our country, to give a full national report, a full international report. And Metro is, to be honest, the area where we've had to make some choices and sacrifices, and there what we decided to do, you've noticed, is, have the Metro report be part of the A section. So you get international, national, and then city news. And we've gone back to the core of New York City and cut back some on our regional coverage in New Jersey and Connecticut and Long Island. That was a painful choice for us, but one that didn't involve sacrifices in other key areas, and we still every week give you a wonderful science section, which doesn't bring in a whole lot of advertising revenue, but is part of our commitment to serving what we call our knowledge audience, which is a high-quality, highly educated audience, which is voracious for everything from science to the latest on fashion, which we gave you today in Thursday Styles.
Good. Dan, Katie Couric said at the Press Club last year that no matter how good she could be, her audience will shrink because the demographic who watch the evening news is, to put it charitably, reaching their expiration date. Do you see an inevitable decline in network television news, and how would the networks deal with that, do you think?
Well, first of all, I do see a decline. I'm not sure it's inevitable, but there's a clear trend line down network news. I think the question for the moment is whether the commitment of the ownership of the large networks, or part of, without exception, I think, large international conglomerates, a lot depends on their commitment as to how far it declines and how quickly it declines. As a personal opinion, I would not be surprised, I'm not predicting what will happen, I would not be surprised to see one or more of the major over-the-airways networks do away with the evening news as we have known it. Having said that, I believe that someone, at least someone, will stay in that core business, and if they redouble their commitment to quality journalism with integrity, I think it will be a good business. I'm not saying it will have the largest circulation nor the best demographics, but I think it will be a good business, the definition being in this context, make money and deliver stockholder value. In the same way that the New York Times doesn't have the largest circulation in the country, they have a very healthy circulation, they have the largest circulation, as Jill has pointed out, they have the, what you call the knowledge readers, which is attractive to advertisers. So I don't think it's all gloom and doom for network television, but I get back to so much depends on whether at the very top, particularly the ownership, whether the ownership goes back to at least some semblance of seeing news as a public trust and has some commitment to making sure that news is practiced in the public interest, which isn't to say that it shouldn't make money. And by the way, the current evening news broadcasts, you can say what you want to about them, they make a lot of money. They don't make as much money as perhaps those who do the accounting would like. It doesn't increase by a certain amount every quarter, but these are money-making machines. But when you talk about the future, whether it be evening newscasts, magazines, newspapers, radio, what have you, that I think what's lacking are two things at the moment. One is optimism. I'm an optimist by nature and experience. And to say that I've been practicing journalism professionally for almost 60 years, I don't profess to be an expert, but I didn't just waddle off the wagon either. And that it can make money, it has made money, it does make money, it can be a good commercial enterprise. But one, we have to stay optimistic about it, not naively optimistic. But so often we concentrate on what we are doing tonight, and I think to good cause. But all of these pronouncements of near death, I think, are premature. And the second thing is idealism. That one reason I'm here tonight without being preachy about it, when we talk about the future of journalism, much depends on some of the people in this room. Whether they succumb to negativism, cynicism, or whether they reach for the highest idealism possible. In those two things, I think, lies the future. and all of our futures as to whether we stop the bleeding of such things that you mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, of entertainment values completely overwhelming news values, tsunami-like, or whether we retrench and begin to slug our way back to at least some symbolism of seeing journalism as a public trust and try to commit ourselves passionately to the responsibilities of that trust.
Now, Jay, you have famously called bloggers and citizen journalists the people formerly known as the audience. As I go across the country, this is a big point. I hear talk of pro-am journalism. I hear journalists rail against the loose standards of citizen journalists who are showing up on mainstream media websites. And most recently, there was the case of a blogger who posted an iReport on CNN.com that Apple CEO Steve Jobs had suffered a heart attack, even though it was totally false. It had the weight of CNN behind it. Where do you see this all going?
First of all, thanks to the National Press Club for bringing your show here to our new institute and our new headquarters. And we're very excited that you're here. And thanks to my co-optimists for joining this panel. I came up with the phrase, the people formerly known as the audience, to take notice of a certain social fact, which is that the tools of media production that Dan specialized in and mastered in his career have now been distributed to the people out there. That is a social fact. People have blogs, they have cameras, they have video, they can edit, they can create their own report, and they can upload it and they can distribute it to the world. So the people formerly known as the audience are simply all those people out there with all those tools for doing media. And because we are an open society, a free society, we know that some of those people are going to pick up those tools and try to inform other people. So that's citizen journalism. When people pick up the tools that they have and they use them to inform other people, that's what I call citizen journalism. So that's just a social fact. And it comes about because we happen to live in a time of amazing transition. And this is why it is fortunate if you're a journalism student today. The way I look at this transition is by focusing on the people that I study, a professional tribe of journalists, which we have representatives of here. I call them a tribe, even though they don't necessarily like that description, because that's what they are. They're a group of people who believe in the public service mission of the press that you just talked about, who work in different companies, different media, different platforms, and who get paid for it, and who have developed a profession that we teach about here at NYU that is about 100 years old, the same age as the National Press Club. And the National Press Club, which tries to create a space for this tribe, right, in Washington, is really part of what I call a tribe. And since I study this tribe, I'm very interested in their fortunes, and the way I see this situation now is that the tribe of professional journalists is in a situation of forced migration, meaning they can't live anymore on the land that they had colonized and developed so successfully for over 100 years. The land gave out. And they realized that right around 2004, when you gave that amazing speech in Hollywood, Tom, to the Online News Association, they realized that if they're going to have a future for their people, for their tribe, they're going to have to migrate across the digital divide and rebuild their life on new soil. So that's what I mean by forced migration. Now, the thing is, when you get there, the most amazing fact, there's people already there developing the web. And they have the powers of the media. They have video, they have text, they have photography. They can distribute their work. Then they are already developing this new land. And so in any situation of migration, which after all is a human trauma, there are people who are excited and they can't wait to get there, to the new land of news. There are people who are afraid. We know them. They work in news organizations, some of them. Right? I call them the curmudgeons, and I never tire of criticizing them and ridiculing them. There's people who don't want to go. There are people who are being shed, as you mentioned, with all the layoffs, because the tribe can't afford them anymore. And the space on which this tribe can develop journalism and grow itself is just shrinking, and so they have to migrate. And in migrating, when you migrate, you have to ask yourself a series of agonizing questions. What can we take with us? What do we know that will be vital on the other side? Right? How can we reproduce our way of life when the land that it sprang from is gone? Are we strong enough to survive in the new world? And what's essential to our way of life? And so the way I see this now is that all of those questions are being asked right now. And people are making the journey over. The AP is making the journey over. The New York Times has made the journey over. And they're discovering that there is a new land of news, and we can thrive there. What's interesting about it for me is that it's a very different land. There are people already there. Territory is free. It's like a frontier. It's like the Wild West. It hasn't been colonized yet. It hasn't been civilized yet. It's still wild in a lot of ways. That's what's fun about it. That's what's cool about it. That's what makes me optimistic.
And let's get to, before we get to Manifest Destiny and the, let's talk about how this is playing out in this election. How is this election changing? How is media changing, the news media changing how they're covering the election, and how are the candidates changing how they're reaching the voters with what's going on? Can anybody want to jump in on that there, Jeff?
I can just anecdotally share with you from last night covering I was supervising the Times' debate coverage, and, we were, as were other news organizations, we have on our caucus blog, Kit Seeley, who was live blogging the debate, and at the same time we had, a video feed of the debate. So it was very cool. I didn't even have to have the television on. I could, watch the debate on my computer screen and watch, Kit Seeley's commentary, right, analyzing things as McCain and Obama said them. And that was not happening in my newsroom in 2004. It wasn't. And, this premium on speed, I'm in awe of, the talent of because Kit Seeley is one of the most experienced, she would have been one of your probably, maybe a curmudgeon 10 years ago. She'd been covering national campaigns, since for the Times, going back to, I met her on the Dole campaign in 96, and, she's just blocked, she has gotten to the new place. She's migrated very successfully and is able to just, write, it's not even on deadline anymore. It's in the instant moment, absorb, analyze, and write about the debate in a way that, holds up. All of the points she made in real time are ones that, other reporters made in different ways, and a little bit more formally in the actual news stories that we had in the paper, full stories on the web this morning in our report. But, it's really something to behold. It's multi-platform coverage with reporters who used to mainly write newspaper stories, now being completely comfortable going out, with cameras, writing a blog post, doing a quick version of a story for the web, and then, going deeper with it for, the next day's paper. It's just what's expected now. And I think, there's a lot of excitement, but more than, the woe is us over the business model and, all of that is I think the most challenging thing to the journalists I work with now at the Times is just trying to do it all and, fill the appetite, especially on something like the campaign, on all our platforms all day and all night long. I think very few of the reporters sleep anymore. I've decided sleep is old. After we migrate, we're not going to have to sleep anymore.
That's right. There is a burnout factor here, and Tom and Jay, I think I'm going to have want to start with Tom, then we'll go right to Jay. Go start with Jay and go to Tom.
Well, during the age of broadcast media, which operated on a one-to-many model, right? One transmitter, many receivers. We had a model of broadcast politics that corresponded to it. So it used to be that to run for president, for example, you hired your consultants and you raised your money and you made your ads and you determined what your message was, right? And then you went out and you tried to win the news day and you put together your polls and the polls told you what the message should be and that's how you ran for president. Broadcast media corresponded to broadcast politics. Well, if we look at the situation today, not from the point of view of what's different about all the political journalists of the New York Times, which is one story, and Jill just described it very well, but if you think of it from the people formerly known as the audience's point of view, what's different today for them is that they're still connected up to big media, to NBC and CBS and the New York Times, but they are also connected horizontally to one another. And not just connected a little bit, but very easily. They can easily connect point to point, many to many, few to few. And it's the overlay of vertical broadcast media messaging you with this new horizontal social media that provides the unique flavor of the campaign now. So that if Obama gives a speech on race and the networks think it's pretty important and they cover it, that's broadcast politics. But when people share it and download it and give it to each other and generate interest on it on their own on YouTube, and it has more downloads at YouTube than it has viewing from the media, then you can see that we had a different system. And so what's different today is that informing people about the campaign is something done by journalists, by the New York Times, by the AP, but also by friends and neighbors, one another, fellow citizens. You can inform yourself much more easily than you could before. And the same things that are true in the media are true in politics. And so we have today a wave of democratic participation in politics, in media and in campaigns. And that ultimately is what's changing the world. The falling costs for like-minded people to locate each other, share information, collaborate, and make themselves heard is going to be a new era in media as well as politics because it allows people to organize themselves in different ways.
Tom, do you have something to add on what's changing?
A couple of things in this campaign are interesting. The Obama campaign had really studied that phenomenon, captured it, I think, better than any of the other candidates.
Absolutely.
On both sides, and really exploited that. And they have done well at micro-targeting and have really come after certain audiences and have then tried to organize them in a way to take them to the next step, or participation or volunteering. It's interesting that Senator McCain's campaign gave the press the most access. And Senator Obama's campaign was not open to the traditional press at all. In fact, the effort was to speak beyond the traditional press. And the traditional press did not have the access. And Senator McCain exhausted the traditional press, would stay on the bus, answer questions well after all the questions had come up that anybody could possibly think of, and he was still ready to go, and the reporters were ready to go to bed. No, 2008, this year. And then, of course, he had to make the transition because it wasn't getting out there. So those are some of the things that have played out this year. We all have new technical aspects. We actually had a former NBC anchor anchoring some of our election night programs. And a couple things I would point out to you, and the interest in this campaign is worldwide. And we had on Super Tuesday a couple dozen international networks at AP, and we had a half dozen going live into drive time in Europe, reporting the results of Super Tuesday. And we have several that have already contracted for election night that will be there and will be going live into drive time in Europe again. So that's one point. And the other point is, I first was part of a presidential campaign in 1964, and then again in 1968. And I can tell you that the depth of information that we now have available is so much better. And how we go after the issues is so much richer. There is so much more available to people. There are more checkers on who's saying what and who's doing what. But for the most part, we have far less access than we did way back when.
There's so many points here, but Dan, I'm really interested in what you're doing. This HDNet, you are getting the backing of a very wealthy person who is letting you create something from the ground up. And when I go across the country, I'm hearing that this is what's going to happen, that new organizations are just going to be built from scratch. And tell us a little bit about how you think that.
Well, I'm glad you asked. When I spoke earlier about the need, the imperative, if you will, of those who own and operate and manage major mass media outlets, what I'm engaged in is something small, a beginning, something that we've built from the ground up, piece by piece. Mark Cuban, who is an entrepreneur who lives in Dallas and made his fortune in the dot-com bubble, he hasn't said this to me, but I think it's clear that he seeks to be in the mold of William S. Paley, Bill Paley, who built CBS News. He was a great believer in saying, listen, I'm in business to make money. After the company went public, I'm in business to deliver stockholder value, but I see news as a public service. Or the Sulzberger family, which owns the New York Times. They're in it to make money. They have to make money to survive. They have to deliver stockholder value and all that. But they hold dear the traditional values of quality journalism with integrity. So in answer to your question, I think part of the future will be people such as the Sulzbergers, the Mark Cubans of the world, who say, I believe in journalism, quality journalism, as part of the red beating heart of American democracy, and that I want to help it. We put on a weekly news program on HDNet, which Mr. Cuban owns completely. It's not a public company. And he told me when he hired me that he would give me complete, total, absolute creative and editorial control. This is unique in my experience. I can't say it's unique in history, but it's unique in my experience. And he has been as good as his word. And therefore, because his business model at the moment and for the foreseeable future is not based on ratings, demographics, or for that matter, advertising, that we spend probably a good 35% of our resources on international coverage, which we consider one of our specialties, and probably no less than another 45% on hard-edged investigative reporting. What's wrong with electronic voting machines? Why do gas cans explode? Those kinds of issues. But I want to broaden out. I know you want the questions. We're talking about, the here and now and what it may tell us about where we're going. It seems undeniable that this 2008 presidential election campaign and the coverage of the campaign will be seen as a kind of tipping point, if you will, a breakover point, not only for American journalism, but I think beyond that. We're witnessing a shift in the balance of power. You may want to argue that it's a slow shift or a medium shift, but certainly a shift in the balance of power towards new media, the kinds of things that Jay Rosen spoke of. And by the way, Jay, if I had known you were going to speak of the tribes, I would have brought my headdress and my wigwam with me, but I didn't realize we'd be getting into that.
They don't like it.
No. But this shift in the balance of power is toward new media, and that has some very important repercussions and will echo through journalism, particularly American journalism, for some time to come. That the 2008 presidential campaign has already earned the nickname, the tag of the YouTube election. And I think there's something in that, you know, exemplified by the Obama song, Scarlett Johansson doing something for Obama, that the online impact in the campaign, which has been tremendous and unprecedented, is also influencing journalists in every newsroom, whether it be over the air or print. It's also influencing opinion makers, opinion leaders, and for that matter, those who sell their opinions. Thanks to a swelling army of amateur journalists and those who see the new way, maybe haven't figured it out, but see it. And the center of gravity is shifting. It's shifting to new media, to online. That doesn't mean that we're going to be without newspapers at some near point, or we're going to do away with the evening news broadcast. You know, it is not true that I was covering politics when Sam Houston was still writing, but I am old enough to remember when radio began to really take traction. There were people, including people in my own neighborhood, who said that's the end of newspapers. Who's going to read a newspaper when you can turn on and get something electronically radio? Goodbye newspapers, radio is going to obliterate them. Well, it didn't happen. And then in the immediate post-war period, it began being television, radio with pictures. We could barely imagine such a thing, but it was taken as a given that television would behead both newspapers and probably radio as well. Well, here we are in 2008, and newspapers are alive. One can argue about how well they are. I do think that these pronouncements about their death are premature, but nonetheless, newspapers can still be a good business. Perhaps a shrinking business, perhaps not as good on dollar for value, but a good business. Magazines, same thing. Strange and mysterious things are happening in the magazine business, which I don't profess to understand. But the point here, the idea of when I say that the center of gravity has shifted to new media and to online, it doesn't mean that anywhere in the near future we're going to be without newspapers, magazines, radio newscasts, or television newscasts, provided, speaking of television newscasts, that they don't succumb completely to the temptation, to the seduction of becoming viewscasts. It's so often now what are advertised as, quote, newscasts, are in fact a viewscast, in which you get 4 or 5 people in the room to shout at one another and give their views, and that's what passes as news.
Joe, it looked like you had something to add there, but the question is, how much can the media pie be sliced before it turns to mush? If you know, supply and demand, you've got so many. The supply of news seems to be growing. But are the bloggers making any money? Is HDNet making any money? And Tom?
Before you answer, let me point out that, with respect, you shouldn't necessarily buy into the idea that it's who's going to get a slice of the pie, assuming that the pie remains the same size. I think the pie will grow, and as the pie grows, if you follow this analogy, which is not nearly as good as Jay's about the tribes and what have you, but that, for example, for a long time in Great Britain, labor organized, said, we want a bigger slice of the pie, whereas American labor during that time said, we want to help grow the pie. So I just want to make that point. It doesn't mean that the pie remains the same size and we're all fighting over what slice of that pie, that the pie is growing. There are people who go online now. There are people who engage in new media who were not watching or listening to the news before, for that matter, reading newspapers, particularly among young people.
Tom?
Let me try to make a couple of points and join the tribe with traditions. But the issue that Jay put on the table is one that once you cross the digital divide to this new promised land, there is not enough fish in game, or in the spirit of this campaign, there is no moose in sight, to have the people, enough people, feed in the manner that they have become accustomed, or in many places in a way that would pay for what we do, which is very expensive. And at these panels, we have content people, and we try our best to give some answer. But the digital divide is a head fake. This is really about a change in distribution. We don't have control over our distribution systems. And the old distribution systems provided lots of money. There was a toll, and the toll could be collected in a number of ways, and that's gone away. So one of the things that's happening before you get to the people who are across that land living so freely and having the time of their new lives with all these new gadgets that are out there, the competitive set has changed. And when we talk in terms of traditional newspapers or traditional networks, there's something else that's come up, and they're living pretty well in both camps. ESPN, CNN, Bloomberg in finance, and then in the entertainment side, you have something called TMZ and some others that are emerging. So there are people that are finding ways to make a lot of money, and they are covering it, and it's more by specific subject than the traditional all-purpose one-size-fits-all. So that's a big part of what's changing, and it starts with the distribution. And frankly, none of us has figured out how to get the funding in the new distribution system. I appreciate what Jay said earlier, but we don't think we're there. We don't think we have sorted out all the issues. We have had a market share that approximates 98% of all media, and that is going to shrink. We know that as the media pie, the traditional media pie shrinks. We have got to make some additional transitions and find new sources of revenue. One of the areas that we've gone in terms of different distribution is to mobile. We launched the Mobile News Network in May. We had 2.6 million page views in May, and in September we had 26 million page views and 500,000 unique visitors, and we're just on Apple, and we're not on all the other phones that are out there. So you can see how fast this can grow if you hit the right channel, and if you reach people such as yourselves who are addicted to iPhones and those devices.
I just want to, before we get any farther, we're going to go to questions from the audience. So if you all wanted to somehow make your way over here to the microphone, but Jay, you quickly had something there.
In my job, I try to look at this problem with a longer view. So my interest is in the journey of the press as part of a free society, open society, over the approximately 300-year interval in which we've had a free press. And if you look at our present situation today, the one we're trying to make sense of tonight, in a 300-year frame, what you see is that the press has evolved into and out of a number of different media systems in that period. So if we checked in the mid-18th century in the press, we would see that it was housed inside a larger business at the time, which was the printing business. The people who were the printers, they did publish newspapers. They published a lot of other things too. So the press was like a part of this other business. And then the press sort of got its own economy with the rise of the newspaper. And then it shifted into being a part of this larger thing called the media. And so I'm optimistic because I think the press can go on and pass through these different media regimes and come out the other side. Now, today, what's peculiar about our situation is that we don't have any business model. We're in between the failure of one or the decline of one and the rise of another one. And that makes people nervous. That's hard to grapple with. It's hard for us as teachers. It's hard for you as students. But we have to look at it realistically. There is no business model. But there will be one eventually if we ask not just what's going to happen to the media industry that once carried the press, but we look at all opportunities for supporting the press, which would include nonprofits who could do certain things in journalism. It would include rich people giving money for ProPublica, that model. It would include citizens funding their own bloggers because they believe in those bloggers and donating money sort of on the NPR model. It would include new ad networks for entrepreneurs and standalone journalists or bloggers who want to perfect their work. So we have to think of the model not as one solution to the crisis of the news industry. There's not going to be any such solution, but instead piecemeal efforts coming from many different directions, all of which have the goal of sustaining quality work in journalism, whoever does it. And some of that will be within the media industry, and some will actually come from outside the industry, because the press today has an amateur zone and it has a professional zone. It's actually been expanded.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. As we say at the Press Club, we stand adjourned.